Chapter 72 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 72. The Black Lion was so far off, and occupied such a length of time in the getting at, that notwithstanding the strong presumptive evidence she had about her of the late events being real and of actual occurrence, Dolly could not divest herself of the belief that she must be in a dream which was lasting all night. Nor was she quite certain that she saw and heard with her own proper senses, even when the coach, in the fullness of time, stopped at the Black Lion, and the host of that tavern approached in a gush of cheerful light to help them to dismount and give them hearty welcome. There, too, at the coach door, one on one side, one upon the other, were already Edward Chester and Joe Willet, who must have followed in another coach. And this was such a strange and unaccountable proceeding, that Dolly was the more inclined to favour the idea of her being fast asleep. But when Mr Willet appeared, old John himself, so heavy-headed and obstinate, and with such a double chin as the liveliest imagination could never in its boldest flights have conjured up in all its vast proportions, then she stood corrected, and unwillingly admitted to herself that she was broad awake. And Joe had lost an arm, he, that well-made, handsome, gallant fellow. As Dolly glanced towards him, and thought of the pain he must have suffered, and the far-off places in which he had been wandering, and wondered who had been his nurse, and hoped that whoever it was, she had been as kind and gentle and considerate as she would have been, the tears came rising to her bright eyes one by one, little by little, until she could keep them back no longer, and so before them all wept bitterly. 'We are all safe now, Dolly,' said her father kindly. 'We shall not be separated any more. Cheer up, my love, cheer up.' The locksmith's wife knew better, perhaps, than he, what ailed her daughter; but Mrs Varden, being quite an altered woman, for the riots had done that good, added her word to his, and comforted her with similar representations. 'Mayhap,' said Mr Willet senior, looking round upon the company, 'she's hungry. That's what it is. Depend upon it, I am myself.' The Black Lion, who, like old John, had been waiting supper past all reasonable and conscionable hours, hailed this as a philosophical discovery of the profoundest and most penetrating kind, and the table being already spread, they sat down to supper straightway. The conversation was not of the liveliest nature, nor were the appetites of some among them very keen, but, in both these respects, old John more than atoned for any deficiency on the part of the rest, and very much distinguished himself. It was not in point of actual conversation that Mr Willet shone so brilliantly, for he had none of his old cronies to tackle, and was rather timorous of venturing on Joe, having certain vague misgivings within him that he was ready on the shortest notice, and on receipt of the slightest offence, to fell the Black Lion to the floor of his own parlour, and immediately to withdraw to China, or some other remote and unknown region, there to dwell for evermore, or at least until he had got rid of his remaining arm and both legs, and perhaps an eye or so, into the bargain. It was with a peculiar kind of pantomime that Mr Willet filled up every pause, and in this he was considered by the Black Lion, who had been his familiar for some years, quite to surpass and go beyond himself and outrun the expectations of his most admiring friends. The subject that worked in Mr Willet's mind, and occasioned these demonstrations, was no other than his son's bodily disfigurement, which he had never yet got himself thoroughly to believe or comprehend. Shortly after their first meeting, he had been observed to wander, in a state of great perplexity, to the kitchen, and to direct his gaze towards the fire, as if in search of his usual adviser in all matters of doubt and difficulty. But, there being no boiler at the Black Lion, and the rioters having so beaten and battered his own that it was quite unfit for further service, he wandered out again, in a perfect bog of uncertainty and mental confusion, and in that state took the strangest means of resolving his doubts, such as feeling the sleeve of his son's greatcoat, as deeming it possible that his arm might be there; looking at his own arms, and those of everybody else, as if to assure himself that two and not one was the usual allowance; sitting by the hour together in a brown study, as if he were endeavouring to recall Joe's image in his younger days, and to remember whether he really had in those times one arm or a pair, and employing himself in many other speculations of the same kind. Finding himself at this supper, surrounded by faces with which he had been so well acquainted in old times, Mr Willet recurred to the subject with uncommon vigour, apparently resolved to understand it now or never. Sometimes, after every 2 or 3 mouthfuls, he laid down his knife and fork, and stared at his son with all his might, particularly at his maimed side. Then he looked slowly round the table until he caught some person's eye, when he shook his head with great solemnity, patted his shoulder, winked, or as one may say, for winking was a very slow process with him, went to sleep with one eye for a minute or two, and so, with another solemn shaking of his head, took up his knife and fork again, and went on eating. Sometimes he put his food into his mouth abstractedly, and with all his faculties concentrated on Joe, gazed at him in a fit of stupefaction, as he cut his meat with one hand, until he was recalled to himself by symptoms of choking on his own part, and was by that means restored to consciousness. At other times he resorted to such small devices as asking him for the salt, the pepper, the vinegar, the mustard, anything that was on his maimed side, and watching him as he handed it. By dint of these experiments, he did at last so satisfy and convince himself that, after a longer silence than he had yet maintained, he laid down his knife and fork on either side his plate, drank a long draught from a tankard beside him, still keeping his eyes on Joe, and leaning backward in his chair, and fetching a long breath, said, as he looked all round the board, 'It's been took off.' 'By George!' said the Black Lion, striking the table with his hand, 'he's got it!' 'Yes, sir,' said Mr Willet, with the look of a man who felt that he had earned a compliment, and deserved it. 'That's where it is. It's been took off.' 'Tell him where it was done,' said the Black Lion to Joe. 'At the defence of the Savannah, father.' 'At the defence of the Salwanners,' repeated Mr Willet softly, again looking round the table. 'In America, where the war is,' said Joe. 'In America, where the war is,' repeated Mr Willet. 'It was took off in the defence of the Salwanners in America, where the war is.' Continuing to repeat these words to himself in a low tone of voice (the same information had been conveyed to him in the same terms at least 50 times before), Mr Willet arose from table, walked round to Joe, felt his empty sleeve all the way up, from the cuff to where the stump of his arm remained, shook his hand, lighted his pipe at the fire, took a long whiff, walked to the door, turned round once when he had reached it, wiped his left eye with the back of his forefinger, and said in a faltering voice, 'My son's arm was took off at the defence of the Salwanners in America, where the war is.' With which words he withdrew, and returned no more that night. Indeed, on various pretences they all withdrew, one after another, save Dolly, who was left sitting there alone. It was a great relief to be alone, and she was crying to her heart's content, when she heard Joe's voice at the end of the passage bidding somebody good night. Good night. Then he was going elsewhere, to some distance perhaps. To what kind of home could he be going, now that it was so late? She heard him walk along the passage and pass the door, but there was a hesitation in his footsteps. He turned back. Dolly's heart beat high. He looked in. 'Good night.